Okay, here we are on the public space. This is one of the foremost channels for intellectual discussion and on YouTube. One of the most recent streams, which was uploaded 11 hours ago, is by JF versus Doovid on evolution. So let's go ahead and look at that. Now it's 3 hours long, so we're not going to I will hide this chat stuff. Whoa! Okay. Now, so I think I was around an hour, 50 minutes, an hour into it when I started watching it, so let's skip to that. So it's a debate on evolution and the merits of it. Let's see. Okay, we'll skip ahead anyway. I didn't see any of this. I'm sure the first hour is very interesting as well. Seems as though they aren't really talking about evolution in the first half of the video. They're on the subject of whether or not you can prove that the soul exists just by looking at the brain. Or more accurately, it would appear that JF is trying to prove that the soul doesn't exist by looking at how stimulating different parts of the brain through, it can be shown that the brain is being stimulated through different sensations. Like if you take a drug, it will affect the frontal lobe, and he's claiming that this is an argument that cognitive functions in the brain arise from the physical, rather than what Doovid is arguing that, and he has a very good point actually, where he states, what does he state? He believes that because there's no actual, well, it would be better if we could get him to say it in his own words, but because there's no actual you can read it here, what they're saying. Yeah, so there's no good working theories for how the brain creates cognitive, mentations, thoughts, ideas, your sense of self. And that's a fairly good point, but JF sort of doesn't like this argument. He feels that Doovid offers no, he feels, I suppose, affronted a bit that Doovid is saying that he's offering no evidence for the idea that the mind produces cognition and mentation, or cognitive functions and mentation, whereas Doovid offered nothing other than to say that just because you don't have a working theory means that you should go back and rely on what your ancestors taught, which is that the soul exists, of course. But there is an argument to be made from the material world, which explains this idea. So let's say you have, and you can use the material world as a basis for this argument for the soul. Let's say you have a piece of hardware like a radio, which now the radio is a physical object, but it's picking up electromagnetic signals, which are also part of physics, but are being broadcast remotely from another location. So, for instance, they are, and then being picked up by the radio. Now, if you damage the radio in some way, that's going to alter how the signals are picked up, or not picked up, as the case may be. But it's not going to alter the signal as it arises from the radio station, maybe 50, 100 miles away. So what that tells us is that it's a similar idea with how people say if you damage a part of the brain, that impairs cognitive function. Therefore, that piece of the brain was responsible for the creation of that cognitive function. Whereas, if we're saying that the soul or that the brain is merely a receiver for information transmitted by the soul, then by damaging one part of the brain, you can affect how the person acts or thinks and affect their cognitive abilities in the future. However, having said that, there's also this concept of, I think there was a great book called the Man Who Thought His Wife Was a Hat Stand or something. But basically, in this book, it talks about all these sort of abnormal occurrences that happen. Like, let's say someone was in a car accident or hit their head, and then suddenly they could speak fluent Chinese, even though they never learnt it, or there were these people. So this idea that just by damaging the brain, you can actually open up more functions that weren't there previously, and that's a very interesting concept. And you could again relate that back to the hardware argument. Let's say I have a computer, like I do here in front of you, in front of me, and I can use this to access the internet. So the information that is coming through into my computer is not stored on my computer. It is being pulled in from the cloud and various servers across the planet. That's all well and good, but let's say I were to upload a computer program onto my machine that altered the flow of information, which made, like, JF and Doovid's faces here all crazy, multicolored, and changed their voice to really high pitch or something. So now within the machine, we are adapting information coming in. Actually, that's not I suppose that would be like similar to taking a drug. You've altered the user's experience, but you haven't really altered the original information, wherever that's coming from. So let's say that the soul will remain, some part of the soul, even within us, can and does remain unaltered during even like extreme doses of LSD or something. There will always be some core part of you that is not affected, and that is borne out by accounts of when Buddhists took large amounts of LSD in the past. I think it was actually I don't know the dose. I think it was like 400 milligrams or something like that. I could be wrong. And and it just didn't affect them. I mean, obviously they were tripping balls, but they couldn't. They could remain completely relaxed because they could stay at this still centered area. So that's impressive. Let's see now. Where are they in the debate? Model almost every aspect. I think they've moved on to evolution at this point, but we're going to stick with the cognitive function idea just for a moment, because I was on a point there about how, what if you had a program which maybe opened up other areas of the internet that aren't always accessible to you, like a program that lets you access the dark web, for example. So maybe Tor would be a good example. So there's like a huge, vast kind of store of knowledge out there on the internet, but all of it isn't accessible. So if you have a good proxy or VPN, you can get around certain blocks and get into other servers in different countries. And so that again suggests that the human is kind of, that we meet on the street or whatever, there's a greater store. You're only seeing like maybe a polarized version of their total being, and that stored behind that there is the soul, which is sort of, as religion tells us, the soul is like immortal and pure and all of this. So and that harkens back to Greek philosophy, which states that you do not learn anything, you simply remember it. So that the entire store of the world, the universe's information is there within you, but in order to play this game, you agree to have that set of knowledge narrowed down so it's more interesting, I suppose. You get to learn things, you get to figure things out. rather than just being a total know-it-all and, you know, like God. You know, I'm sure it could be quite boring being God, really, because you've nowhere to go because you are everywhere. You've nowhere to be because, you know, you're every when, and you know, there'd be no kind of cause for movement, so you just sit there and do nothing. And you know everything already, so there's nothing left for you to discover. These kind of things. I mean, that might be one of the reasons why God did decide to make a universe, just so that he could run and give it free will. But then again, when you get into areas of you know, theology that states that God does ultimately know how the program is going to end, that kind of seems to negate that idea a bit. But that's getting off the point a bit. Now, so to show the organ of the brain produces thought, that is false. We don't have a computer. Oh yeah, so JF is they're still arguing about this computer thing. So we don't have computer models that model the amygdala, the parietal parts of the brain. Yeah, he kind of misunderstood Doovid's argument a bit and went off on one. He did that a lot during this debate. But Doovid was it wasn't like see the way it says Doovid versus JF down here. It wasn't actually you know, an internet blood sport, as they call it, because Doovid repeatedly said that he wasn't trying to defeat JF on this, and I think the reason for that was because JF's knowledge of genetics and that area of science, possibly biology, is much higher than most people's, and that's kind of how he rose to fame in the first place. Wasn't it the Kraut versus the Kraut debacle? Was Sargon involved in that? Can't remember. Anyway, so yeah, Old Hype did some good stuff on that as well. His videos are very good. You should check them out. I'm sure you probably know of him if you're watching this. So perhaps, so now I think they're going into some analogy that JF has, which is sort of irrelevant. So we'll move on. Oh yeah, so this is the part of the debate that's dealing with evolution, and specifically, I think they're talking. It's just not that they talk about natural selection, but right at the outset they get into they reach an impasse between JF and Doovid's definition of what life is. So that was interesting because JF seems to think that uses a slightly unorthodox definition of life, which is which apparently arises from what's that guy's name? He's one of the 4 horsemen of atheism or whatever, atheism plus. I can't believe I've forgotten his name. Anyway, so basically it's the idea that life is described it's Richard Dawkins. Always get confused. Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, whatever. Hawkins, right. So he seems to have a different definition, because like ordinarily in science we'd say things like RNA is not alive, but it's a replicating molecule. DNA is not alive because again it's a molecule and it can replicate itself, and it's kind of the basic building blocks of life, as everyone says. And then DNA, RNA. And another good example are viruses. Viruses are said to not be alive, again because they're molecular in structure. Another reason I was thinking might be because they don't replicate themselves technically. They have to get into a cell first in order to use the biomechanism within the cell to replicate further copies of it. But that is replication at the end of the day. It doesn't matter what mechanism it uses. If it can replicate itself, it is a replicator. Fair enough. I think that, although I haven't read the book that JF is talking about regarding Richard Dawkins, I would say that he's probably going along those lines, or something, that a virus is able to replicate itself, therefore it should be considered as life, along with all of the other more macro organisms, bacteria and animals, plants, etc. However, this definition seems to fly in the face of the ordinary scientific definition, which states that in biology, so I'm sure maybe some of the writing up here agrees with Jeff, maybe it doesn't, I don't know, and I'm not reading it, but what I was taught in school was that you have 7 different descriptors of what life is. So we can see them here: homeostasis, regulation of the internal environment to maintain a constant state, for example, sweating to reduce temperature. Okay, organization, being structurally right. So straight away we noticed that as far as DNA, certainly viruses and RNA are definitely not regulating their environment. It's debatable whether DNA does. DNA is part of a cell, and the cell is certainly regulating its own environment. So any type of environmental regulation going on within DNA could be seen to be merely an aspect of a cell's homeostasis. Organization, being structurally composed of one or more cells. So right, well, being structurally composed of one or more cells, does that really, are cells constructed of cells? Aren't cells alive? Like, is bacteria constructed of cells? I don't know, but they're certainly organized. But then so is DNA. Metabolism, transformation of energy by converting chemicals. Right, so again, there's no metabolism going on in compounds, molecules like DNA and RNA. You could probably come up with some weird example of what what constitutes metabolism, or a weird definition of it, and say they fit into it, but in the main, no. Growth, maintenance of a higher rate of anabolism and catabolism. A growing organism increases in size. So I think you get the idea. Reproduction here is the last one. This is replication, and although it's saying no, yeah. So basically JF is ignoring all of these and Dawkins just to focus on this one reproduction thing. It's quite idiotic, I think. Okay. So from this point of view, we have. Hang on a sec. This sort of definition of life then leads to, what would you say, certain ridiculous conclusions, such as that, if the definition of life is a replicator, then you could have a machine that replicates itself. So is the machine alive? I don't think so. What about on a computer system? You could have viruses, viruses replicate on computer systems. Are computer viruses alive? Obviously not. So this idea of replication as a definition for life leads to just ridiculous conclusions in the end. So I think that's kind of pretty much busted. So the purpose of JF's point to define life as to define replicators as life was, I think, to show a study that had only come out in the last 6 months, where scientists had been able to create life in a laboratory. Now that's huge news, which I hadn't heard about before. Basically, It's some sort of amino acid or something they created in a laboratory that can self-replicate. But I believe he showed, and even he posted the link to the article, and Doovid had a look at it and pointed out that it was only theoretical though. But I think JF was adamant that this had occurred. So it's interesting. If your definition of life is a replicator, then yes, you could say that they created life in a laboratory, and this then goes from the point. This stems from the point that Doovid was making originally, that about the idea of how does living material, organic life, come from inorganic material. And so JF is trying to show that yes, it is possible, except he kind of really misses the point that Doovid is making about, and it's an interesting point, which is simply put, what is the probability needed for life, basic life, even to emerge from just random matter, inorganic materials, or not inorganic, but lifeless matter. And he kind of breaks it down interestingly, although he doesn't actually get into the numbers. We would have to assume that the chances of like chains of amino acids forming, it's quite high, because we haven't seen it happen in nature since its original occurrence was supposed to have happened, 4 billion years ago or something. So it ain't happening all the time. And the big deal there then is, how do those chains of amino acids or whatever become more organized into DNA, and then cells have to be sort of reproducing elsewhere, because one of the big major breakthroughs of evolution was when mitochondrial DNA entered into the cell and then became the powerhouse, and that separates the two main branches of life, karyotic and eukaryotic. I think that's right. I'm certainly no expert on this. But I do find it interesting. And so, as many people do, this debate has been going on for a long time now. Let's see. Oh yeah. Sometimes it's not so easy to follow the conversation based on Google's subtitles, because as you know, they're auto-generated, and sometimes they're not always bang on, but it is a very good system anyway. I'm not complaining. What the program is: Jews learn Jewish history, how many times nations Jews have been kicked out of collectively. Oh, okay, so this is one of the super chats they're reading, which is why it seems like the conversation has gone completely off the point. It's kind of an interesting question. Jews just raped our women, stole our property, and that's a pretty negative thing. Fortunately happened quite often in European history. Okay, too bad. Oh, so they're talking about pogroms there. Yeah, whatever. Here, oh, okay, so I think they're back to the, might have skipped ahead a bit too far here. Let's just go back. Right, it's probably going to be impossible to find all these little time codes where different parts of the conversation spark up and where they end. We might get lucky though. Let's see. So we just went over the concept that replicators can't really be the definition of life. So I think Doovid goes for a kind of a different angle anyway, in trying and they kind of go back to the idea of cognition and the soul a bit here. When stating something like, oh yes, JF says something very interesting about how, you know, anything you can think of has a basis in reality. And I'm not so sure if this is right, but in another way, we'll give it to him, you know, that if you have a dream or a thought, it's always going to be constructed out of things from your environment. So you're never going to see like a brand new color in your mind or anything, or a new shape that's never existed or can't exist. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's true, but it sounds reasonable. Well, there is an argument against that, but we won't go into it because we'll stick with the arguments Doovid made, because they are sort of unique to him. Well, not that they're unique to him, but they are research that he's done, and it's a very good point in the sense that it has a lot of historical backing, because he brings up Plato's theory of forms, which we have here. It's like in Plato's argument, non-physical but substantial forms or ideas present the most accurate reality. So Doovid is kind of using this argument that ideas, so you can't have a perfect circle in nature, for example, but ideally you can have the perfect circle. So whether through a mathematical model modeled in your mind, or just simply by constructing a perfect circle in your mind, although I'm not sure about that, but certainly you know, the idea that the mind is of God, perhaps, or yeah, that you could have pure you know, an idea could be pure, and you could have pure forms of ideas, and that relates back to the idea that the soul is pure in some sense. So again, it's a mystical, metaphysical origin of the mind and the soul as being from a truer reality that is outside of the physical. And I don't think JF doesn't like this idea, and he basically just says, you know, again, there's no proof of this, and it you know, show me these ideal forms, or whatever he wants to say for that. But then the interesting thing about it is that we can loop the two arguments around each other. But perhaps, yeah, we can do that. We could loop the two arguments around, because if we go back to the idea of the definition of life being a replicator, then one of the big, this is another one of Hawkins' arguments actually, and it's kind of interesting the way, or Richard Dawkins' arguments, and it's kind of interesting the way that Dawkins' logic, as presented by JF here, becomes self-defeating, because Dawkins is the originator of the term meme, M-E-M-E, which is the idea that just as genes can replicate themselves, so too can thoughts. So if a thought is particularly advantageous or useful, you will see it kind of propagate through the memosphere, I suppose, of certainly we see that all over the internet. You have this thing called meme magic, or just memes in general, really. Doesn't have need to be anything to do with magic. Okay, so, and that they do replicate. So if memes are capable of replication, does that mean that memes are alive? You know, and if we do have to settle on that as a scientific truth, that is true by definition, that memes are alive, then aren't memes just ideas? So then if we stitch it all back together again, then that means ideas are alive, and therefore this idea, the concept of the soul, that we aren't just emerging out of matter, but that our mind is like a thing in itself, and that it constitutes a real reality, and possibly the only real reality, which we will get into in a minute, hopefully. And that means that, yeah, it supports Plato's arguments and Doovid's earlier point, and negates JF's point at the same time. It was interesting slam dunk, and it's interesting that Doovid didn't really notice it, but I guess when you're sitting in front of a computer screen maybe and you have all of this information coming at you, it might be hard to focus. But also Doovid didn't seem to want to destroy JF's argument, so I'm not entirely sure what he was there. But he was more there just to tell people how it's okay, they don't need to feel stupid for believing in the soul and all of that. And yeah, I respect that. And maybe it's good not to always be smart ass defeating other people's arguments when it's not necessary. That's exactly what I'm doing here. So yeah, and the final one, of course, and this has been said many times before, is that you have the mind, the matter before mind principle, which is the materialist view that JF is supporting here. The matter comes first, and it's a very logical concept that matter begins, and then from that we have amino acids form, and then DNA, life, and then it branches out and becomes more and more complex until finally you have like humans and other animals wandering around, and it's all a kind of progression really, even though in quotation marks the evolutionists, they see no hierarchy to the structure. So from a purely scientific evolutionary point of view, there is no hierarchy. Humans are not at the top, and this is clearly nonsense. It's nonsense from a religious point of view, and it's probably nonsense just from a basic epistemological point of view. From the point like observational, it's clear that humans are at the top of some food chain, and we got here because of certain benefits we have to do with cognition, and that's just a fact. But obviously a reason why something like that would be pushed, and I personally actually I don't believe that most evolutionary biologists buy into that. They might say that they do just to close down an argument here or there, although I'm not sure how many evolutionary biologists are actually online arguing with people about this subject. I think it's more just fedora atheist kids doing it or something. I think evolutionary biologists have better things to do with their time, which says something about myself probably as well. Not putting JF down here now. So yeah, we have that mind before matter. Oh yeah, the opposite side then is a mind before matter, and this again goes back to Plato's forms, because if Plato's correct and that ideas are the real foundation of the world, then that means, and also lots of different religions share this, because we have the materialist view that JF propounds, and now there's the spiritualist view, or the spiritual view, which all religions will put forward. For example, in Buddhism, it is a mind before matter religion, so that basically first there was a mind, and then the mind created matter. And the reason why the mind creates matter is because it's sort of matter is kind of, and reality and perception is unfolded into the mind. So once the mind originates, all of reality unfolds out of it, or unfolds out of it. But anyway, that's all well known stuff. I'm just repeating what other people have said and discovered before me, although it is interesting that there's this kind of back and forth argument about it, you know, and that people like maybe like JF here won't admit that both arguments are on the table and both are equally valid arguments. Now, they also do discuss Occam's razor here at some point, or Occam's razor, I always get it wrong. Anyway, they do discuss that, and it kind of relates to what we're talking about here, because there's the idea that if you have a mind before matter scenario, and well, God would fit into that, because God is thought of as a sort of an immaterial being without, you know, it has no body and it has no space and time. God is not an object. It is something outside of that. So God fits into that kind of criteria as well, of being a mind before matter entity. So you know, even so, religions like Judaism and Christianity would also fit into a mind before matter or spiritual kind of concept. Although within Christianity, it's sort of been evolved a bit, in the sense that God became a man in Jesus, and then Jesus left the earth again, or left this physical plane bodily. So, and as he did so, he also kind of aged. So this idea of the old man with the grey beard in the sky is actually kind of accurate, because God did become an old man. It's kind of funny. Anyway, I like it. But yes. So where else? Where are we? Oh yeah, Occam's razor. Occam's razor. And how it applies to this concept. Because interestingly, some people would say that, you know, we could just look at the material world and we can come up with theories of evolution and say that, oh well, we have these amino acids, and then we know that they could have developed into these cells, and that these cells group together to form multicellular organisms, and that's all very logical, and we don't need this extra hypothesis of a god to bring it all together. But then in the case of like a mind before matter kind of concept, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to produce, you know, how did matter begin? So it's very difficult to deduce the beginning of the entire universe, the material universe, from matter itself. There needs to be, you know, this going into cosmological arguments here about what caused the Big Bang, and obviously there must have been something else prior to the Big Bang which created it, and that's usually I'd say that the most the forerunning scientific opinion on this is that there's extra dimensions and they collide. Brain theory, matter antimatter collisions, some kind of breakdown in was it CP parity or charge parity violation. So in that concept, but more important, so you could say that God did that, but you know, they're saying that it would be, again using Occam's razor, that it is to have God as this entity. But if God was originally this, you know, spaceless, formless entity which is just purely made out of ideas, then that is a lot simpler than building up all of these massively complex theories of brain theory and M theory and the bulk and 27 dimensional, oh no, sorry, no, it's never 27, but, you know, 26 all the way down to 6 different dimensional theories, or 10 or whatever, of string theory and bosonic string theory, which uses 8. So the whole thing gets very complicated, I think, that way. But I mean, those complicated theories are good, and I like a bit of string theory. It's great, beautiful use of mathematics. Now, I'm also not against evolutionary theory in the sense that it's laid out. I just think that maybe it's still too early to state that that we know it all and that we've disproven God based on this theory. I think that's Doovid's point, and I think it's a valid one. We don't have a working model of the brain, as he said, and we don't really have a working model of evolution either. But that's not to say that one couldn't come about in future. But this idea that science has the means to predict and explain everything in the universe is completely wrong. And actually, there's a great video online of Dawkins himself asking one of these very preeminent scientists of his day. They're sitting in like a really lavish room, and he asks him about that question, and the scientist like adamantly states that science, at this point they're looking at it, science isn't going to figure everything out. Not even half of it. We won't even know what we don't know, if you know what I mean. So, fascinating concept. My own theory is that one of the biggest roadblocks, and I could be wrong about this, because when you read these sort of anti-evolutionary sites, sometimes you get some bad information, but you can get bad information from any source, even from a pro evolutionary site, and that's happened many times in the past. So we shouldn't jump on that and say, you're wrong, you're trying to twist the narrative or whatever. So here they're talking about the whole replicators and all. So my one of the kind of big roadblocks or stumbling blocks with evolution is this idea that they were supposed to do these progressively more complex versions of life. So it would start off with a single cell, and then when they grouped together into multicellular organisms, at first it would have been something very basic like a blob, and then later on the blob would develop maybe would have had a mouth, maybe it would develop some sort of mechanism for chewing, and then over time it kind of developed bones, and then different organs kind of grouped together and became more. So it's the theory of like increasing complexity, and then these more simple organism becomes a more complicated one, and so on, and branches until we get all of the different phyla, which are the main phylum, the plural of phyla. So yeah, life, domain, kingdom, phylum. Right, moss animals, worms would be another. Right, so worms are a phyla maybe. Right. Plants have different divisions of phyla, such as mosses, conifers would be a phyla, I guess. So it's kind of close on species. I mean, the division of all of these things is probably quite arbitrary in some sense, but we'll go with it and not question everything. So basically the thing is that when they look back into the fossil record, they see that no, there are none of these early transitionary fossils getting steadily more complex. Instead, we just see all of the phyla appear at once, and that I think this was even pre-Cambrian explosion, but the Cambrian explosion is another example of it, where just all of the and I think 96% of the phyla that emerged in that period, 96% of them are gone. So what we see here all resulted from all the life left is that just came from the 4% phyla left. So really we have to ask ourselves, is how did obviously the evolutionary theory is wrong then on some level, and what I believe is another conundrum is, I have my timing is all wrong here, but I think let's say life came about 4 billion years ago or something in a single cell organism. Well, 90% of the time, it's probably way earlier than that. Timeline of life. Give that a go. Probably won't work. Yes. So, what is this? Scale millions of years. Earliest Earth. Earliest water. So we're going back 4.5 billion years. Then, right. So single celled life came around the 4 billion year mark, I think. Yeah, you get the idea anyway. So, and then photosynthesis occurred, and then eukaryotes. So multicellular. So you had this incredibly long period of time here where it's just essentially bacteria and single cell organisms knocking around in the oceans and on land and stuff. And then something happened at this point here, about 15 million years ago. 1.5 billion years ago, I think is it. Yeah, where they'd kicked into a multicellular thing, and then from this we have the modern day phyla, or kingdoms here. So it's all quite recent, even the dinosaurs and stuff. So what occurred to make this change happen from eukaryote into multicellular life? And what I believe is the answer to that is that it was a kind of quorum sensing. So in quorum sensing, once bacteria get to a large enough population, they release certain chemicals, or well, actually I'm not sure if they know how quorum sensing is done, but it shifts them all into a different gear. So I believe that maybe after, what is this, 3 billion years of reproduction in the oceans, they decided, right, we've done with this mode, quorum sensing kicked in, and they all shifted into becoming multicellular life, and it happened very rapidly. But that could be over millions of years as well. But so that's my theory. And yes, they're talking about amyloid. Oh, this must be there. So they're still harping on about replicators. Anyway, so that's the video. Thanks for watching.